My wife used to say language was a house I never left. Lyra meant it kindly, even when she didn't. She would wave a hand at the screen where I was building another model of how a dead culture might have asked for water or permission or mercy. And she'd say, "Kieran, come back to the street. People live out here." When the azure flu took her in a 12-hour fever on Vesta, I moved into that house and locked the door from the inside. I spoke to syntax instead of neighbors. Silence became the only conversation that didn't ask anything of me. The summons arrived as a lattice of priorities threaded through the coalition's courier net. Plain text wrapped in diplomatic pressure. Request for specialist. Cryptosemiotics, extinct logic frameworks, non-human authorization grammars. Destination, Chiron 3 relay array, orbiting within the gas giant's magnetotail. Rationale, confirmed anomalous transmission, non-local origin, persistent. Clearance, temporary, elevated. It did not say please. It did not mention Lyra. It did not need to. I packed a small case, looped the strap twice around my wrist so it wouldn't slip, and left the apartment as if I might return before the kettle cooled. I did not. From high Earth orbit, the shuttle fell toward the jump gate like a bead into a throat. There is a moment, standing in a harness while the hull sings, when everyone's breath sinks without decision. It is the nearest thing the living do to prayer. Then the gate field took us and let us go near Chiron, a striped and bruised world filling the window like a closed fist. The relay station held close to the dark line of its magnetotail, shielded from the worst of the planet's snarl. It looked like a paper knife stuck through a shadow, long spine, antennae folded tight, docking ring lit with the kind of frugal care engineers learn in cold places. Major Ricks met me at the lock with gloved hands and the calm of someone trained to be furniture until needed. His visor hid his eyes. The rest of his face did not bother. Dr. Kieran. The voice had the clipped cadence of issued boots. "Your effects will be scanned and returned. Please follow." He turned and I followed. The station air had that processed sharpness. Metal rinsed in snow. We moved down corridors like veins. Somewhere distant, the array flexed and the floor answered in sub-audible vibration. I imagined the whole structure listening and not liking what it heard. It is a long walk between doors on a station that cannot afford unnecessary ones. We crossed through a flexible joint into the core where shielding mass was thickest, where information went to be handled by people who had stopped blinking. The last door was a double bind, pressure seal, identity lattice, a whisper of hard radiation counterpulsing against my skin. Inside, 3 people and a screen. Dr. Arena Cell did not look like the papers that had gotten her this job. The papers were tidy, her hair not. A gray streak ran through the braid like a statement of non-compliance. It made her look younger, not older. Her hands were wrapped around a cup with the concentration of someone reminding herself to be warm. "You came quickly," she said, and set the cup down, as if that released me from obligation. Major Ricks took his place at the wall and became furniture again, alive in the way a spring is alive. The third person, a technician whose name tag read VANN, kept his eyes on the console and his fingers on a field of light, not the people. It was how you survive in rooms like this. Beat a hand, not the fist. The screen showed 6 words. "This key is not for you." I did not speak for a breath. Then another. The sentence had been translated into Coalition Standard, but the shape underneath was still there, like a fossil under paper. I could feel the edges of a form not captured by our letters. Origin? I asked. Van answered. A structure in orbit around Chiron 4's third moon. Fixed position. The transmission is line of sight only, extremely narrow beam, but we're catching side scatter along the magnetotail. It repeats at precise intervals. Identical phrasing, identical power envelope. Interference? I said. Irina lifted one shoulder, a careful refusal to commit. We've stripped the carrier to noise. The surrounding spectrum is clean. The station was built for radio astronomy and subspace interferometry. If there were a reflection, we'd see its teeth. She paused. We have not. Threat assessment? Major Ricks asked, voice carefully neutral, interrogation given a form that was not personal. We don't have enough, I said, and the words tasted like old chalk. It reads like a denial phrase, gate language, but a sentence is a surface over a machine. We need the machine, he repeated. The grammar that produces behavior, I said, and nodded toward the line on the screen. Those 6 words aren't just content. They're a performance, refusal enacted through syntax. If it is a gate, the sentence is a hand that closes as you reach. Irina stood, the decision to move itself a kind of permission granted to the room. We'll give you the capture. Everything raw, including the phase symmetry we haven't resolved. You'll have a lab. She glanced at Ricks. The Major inclined his head by 1 degree. That was how agreements were made here, in increments small enough to roll back without audit. They led me to a compartment near the array spine. The lab was honest. A bench, a chair that adjusted to a back not yet ready to trust, a projection field, and a port to the station's data throat. Through the narrow window, the planet's limb cut the dark like a bruise that refused to fade. When the door shut, the air felt more like mine. The packet arrived with the speed of need. Recordings from 3 days of observation, the station clock's heartbeat, the station's own noise, so I could subtract its song from everything else. I touched the projection field and raised the sentence into space. 6 words turned into scaffolding, phoneme estimates, stress mapping, the guessed bones beneath our alphabet. It was a thin skeleton, but I have built bodies from less. Before thread, you test faith. I wrote quick integrity programs, the unromantic checks bureaucrats love to see on page 1, power stability, carrier drift, symbol consistency, repetition boundaries. The capture was clean enough to drink. I signed a verification packet and sent it down the station's cabled throat to Irina's permissions board. It returned, received. Across the corridor, someone laughed in the muted way people do when they remember it's allowed. The station's constant breath filled the rest. I brought thread awake. The interface came up plain, almost shy. A narrow ribbon of controls along the bottom edge, the kind of tool that assumes you already know where every handle is. I built it before Lyra, rewrote it during her fevers to give my hands something to do other than fail, and spent the months after on its blind edges, sharpening as if a sharp tool could blunt grief. Thread does not translate, it models use. Give it a sentence and it looks for the allowable moves the sentence permits the mind to make. It maps force, where pressure can be applied, where the structure resists. It is a machine that learns the machine under language. I fed the first capture into its mouth. The sentence unspooled through phonological space and layered into something like a blueprint. Our characters dissolved in something older surfaced, a topography of constraints and allowances. Thread began to overlay probable functions, refusal, boundary, non-identity, ownership, abstracted to authorization. Every label provisional, every color a footnote that read, "We could be wrong." I split the projection into two panes. Left, the sentence as we saw it. 6 words in the standard, black on pale, the way we comfort ourselves. Right, the sentence as thread was beginning to understand it, a field of vectors, weights pulling toward or away from invisible anchors. Between them, me, interpreter of a bridge only briefly coincident with land. "Not for you," I said aloud quietly, and watched the projection shift. Speech in the lab was a control input. Thread maps its own listener. The system marked my utterance, self as object of exclusion. It had heard my voice and added me as a potential participant in the scene the sentence imagined. I turned that feature off. There was only one conversation here, and I was not allowed to pretend I could join it. Intervals. Repetition. The packet held 3 days of pulses, each one precise enough to use as a clock. I stacked them like pages, everyone laid perfectly atop the last. I adjusted the scale until the stack was a single plane, gray with the overlapping thinness of almost sameness. My eyes went fog blind, and I thought of Lyra dropping a blanket over a cage when we adopted a rescue bird on Vesta, how the creature had gone instantly silent, as if the sky itself had vanished. My hands stopped. I told myself to stand. On stations, night is assigned, not gathered. The lighting cooled. Somewhere, a corridor's sounds diminished by decree. I brewed dry tea in a bulb and burned my tongue because I did not want to wait. Thread hummed softly, a lapsed choir warming scales. I wrote a small script to count micro variations between repetitions, not in the band where message rides, but in the band where carriers breathe. It was not a place you look for meaning unless you have spent years listening for it. Out the window, Chiron turned its slow, bruised face. The magneto-tail flickered. I felt the lab floor answer in that subaudible way again and realized my body had already learned the station's normal shiver. This one was not normal. The bone behind my right ear tingled. I set the bulb down and watched the numbers. The clock ticked through the first day. Nothing, the second. Noise canceled rhythm. The third day approached like a tide, knowing where it was allowed to go. The script chirped, a bright insect sound in a room built to discourage living things. On the screen, a single value flipped 2 positions, then flipped back on the next pulse. I scrolled back through the stack, now flattening each message into a single point, one in every 7,217. Flip, return, flip, return, not drift, not decay, choice. There are only 2 things that do the same thing at the same time for days without tiredness: machines and faith. Machines do not make small intentional mistakes unless asked. I had found a smudge left by a careful hand to prove the page was not a copy. I did not report. Not yet. It was not a discovery if the machine could make me a liar later. I wrote another script, this one designed to be boring and stubborn, run for 3 more days, mark every flip, compare against station temperature, vibration, power draw, crew schedules, Chiron magneto-tail variation. If you're going to accuse a stranger of meaning, be sure it is them and not the cough in your own throat. Before the lab pulled its lighting down to the minimum, Irina pinged a text-only line. "Have you eaten?" It was maternal without condescension, the kind of cadence that implies longevity. You eat because you will be here long enough to need to. I answered with honesty, "Tea." A pause. "We'll send soup." When the messenger came, I signed for it without stepping away from the projection. The scent was garlic and a memory of Earth. I ate with the bulb held between my knees, the spoon clinking the side in a steady domestic music out of place among field equations. At 0300 station time, the array flexed again, and this time the floor did not answer. Thread fluttered. The projection shifted subtly, like a chest making a breath you thought it had given up. The next pulse arrived intact. Flip. Return. The script marked it, and the mark did not correlate to anything the station controlled. I felt, for the first time since the summons, a pinprick of something like joy. To find an intention is to discover a hand holding yours through the glass. It does not matter whether the hand intends comfort or removal. It is still a hand. In the morning cycle, the verification packet I had sent earlier came back from Arena with a short addendum. Coalition Board requests you prioritize confirming non-reflexive origin, not a station echo. Rix requests an actionable threat index once feasible. My request is coffee when you surface. I composed a reply in 3 parts, in the order she offered them. Non-reflexive origin. Probability increased to 0.93 given interval irregularities inconsistent with station harmonics. Threat index, insufficient data, current sentence functions as authorization refusal, not as deterrent or warning. Coffee. When this stack becomes a wall. I hovered over the send field for a beat, then added, the message behaves like a gate. Gates are not built without doors. I slept for 2 hours with my forehead on the edge of the bench and woke unsure which world I had left. Thread was still awake, patient, the way a good tool forgives human interruption. The scripts were still counting. Outside, Chiron had turned just enough to make the light's angle different. Perspective is a cheap trick the universe uses to remind you that time continues without permission. At 10 o'clock, I did what I had avoided since I arrived. I said Lyra's name into the empty room. The lab recorded the syllables, marked them as noise. I watched the mark fade like a footprint sealed over by new snow. It was a good punishment. It kept me in the work. Before I left to deliver a verbal briefing, security prefers mouths when words begin to matter. I wrote one short note to myself at the bottom of Thread's log. The private place where a scientist is allowed to be a person so long as the person does not leak into the math. This key is not for you. Underneath it, I typed, then for whom? And how do we teach it to be wrong? When I entered the core chamber again, Arena had 2 cups and the kind of stillness you earn. Major Rix stood where he had before, but the way his hand rested on the table had changed by one muscle. Van did not look up. His seeing was elsewhere. I delivered the only thing that could be delivered honestly. The transmission is consistent and not an echo. It performs refusal in grammar, not just content. There is an intentional interval irregularity not accounted for by station harmonics or Chiron's magnetotail. I am building a model of its authorization logic. If the sentence is a hand that closes, we may be able to learn what shape it is trying to fit. Rick said, in terms clear enough for a soldier to carry to someone who will not read your report. It's a lock, I said. I think it's listening for the sound of the right key. We are making the wrong sounds. Arena's eyes softened, then sharpened again, both actions practiced. How long? I don't know, I said. I did not look away. But I can tell you where to place the listening post and when to expect the next breath. In the corridor back to the lab, the station lights dimmed and brightened again as the power shunted to a sensor array I had requested the hour before. Somewhere, A quartermaster signed a form that would later be used to blame or praise. The station turned its ear, and the bruise of the planet rolled on. In the lab, I sat, and Thread raised the sentence once more. 6 words like a door. Behind them, more space than a life can cross. I put my hands on the table, palms down, as if to steady the station itself, and told the machine the first truth it needed from me. "I understand you're not for me," I said, and did not press the key that would make it listen yet. Thread ran for 3 days and nights while the station feigned the difference between them. The cycles were for circadian mercy, not machines. The machine did not care. Every 7,217 repetitions, the flip returned like a tide that only a tide table would love. I mapped each perturbation against the station's telemetry until the overlays looked like reeds in a river, flexing, aligning, then passing clean through one another. The station had rhythms. The sentence had will. Irina visited once each cycle. She had learned to make her footsteps audible outside my door, so I could choose whether to be human before she entered. On the second day, she brought a packet of old fruit leather folded like documents. On the third, she brought a small plant from her quarters, a tough little vine that tolerated daylight assigned by committee. She set it on the ledge between the window and my bench. "For perspective," she said, "it doesn't know it's near a gas giant." I found myself looking up at the vine as if it were an instrument that could read a softer spectrum. Major Ricks did not come. He registered his presence with requests filtered through Irina's tidy text. Security queries. Is there an authentication marker we can mimic? Behavioral shift if transmission is blocked? Could we break the beam? Breaking is always the first tool in a soldier's kit. I kept my answers brief and honest. No markers yet. No shift if our receivers mute. The source doesn't wait for our acknowledgments. Yes, we could break the beam, but the beam is not the conversation. He did not reply to that last line, which was wise. The station's quartermaster, a woman named Perret, I only met once on a supply run, grew indulgent in the way logistics can be when a crisis is not yet an emergency. Extra field programmable arrays appeared in my queue. A beta signal isolator materialized on my bench with a "found in storage" note and no signature. Van rerouted me a slice of raw feed from the subspace interferometers. Temporarily don't get attached. Small conspiracies of kindness accreted around the work like the first thin crust on cooling metal. Thread's map of the sentence thickened, not like a wall, but like a forest. New branches, cross-grained paths, clearings we had not known were there. The refusal I had labeled in the first hour remained central, but now I could see how it sat inside something larger, what I started to call the permission lattice. Some languages put their labor into verbs, some into honorifics, some into tense. This one built cathedrals out of allowance. To speak within it was to locate yourself on a grid of what may be asked and by whom. Every utterance was a performed credential. I built a toy to teach myself what Thread was showing me. A little board on the projection field with 3 pegs, speaker, listener, authority, and a halo that brightened or dimmed around each as I simulated moves. In our language, I would say, unlock, and the verb would shoulder most of the burden. In the locked language, there was no verb until there was permission. You first had to make yourself a shape that the lattice would not reject. Thread did not know what those shapes were. It could only flag the existence of the gate and the pressure required to push through it. On the fourth station morning, something small in me remembered another small thing. Lyra's grandmother's cedar chest, which had a lid that would not seat unless you pressed it in exactly the right spot. The wood had warped to its own history and demanded that future hands learn the past. I found my right hand making the old pressure on the bench, 2 fingers and a thumb, and felt foolish and tender at once. The 7,217th flip was not a number chosen by us, which made it precious. I took the stack of repetitions and shifted them into a spiral, each loop a complete message, each marker a pinprick of light. The spiral looked alive in a way straight lines never do. Once it was a body, I could see it breathe. The flips moved along the curve with a slow precession, drifting like a lighthouse beam over fog. The irregularity was not irregular at all. It was a scan, not of us, but of its own threshold. Self-check, I said, and Thread, always eager to mimic a user's faith, created a provisional node with that label, a square anchoring the spiral's slow turn. I fed a hypothesis into the model, soft as a question. Each cycle evaluates a property not contained in the sentence's content, but in its mode of delivery. Thread flashed an amber dot, a maybe with teeth. I smiled despite myself. Machines ought not to be cute. It is dangerous to love the feeling that something understands you. But in a life arranged around silence, fidelity to pattern feels like kindness. Irina drank her coffee in my doorway and watched the spiral process across the room. "You're sure it isn't checking us? I'm sure it doesn't know we're here," I said, and felt the words like a bruise pressed, the old ache of being unseen returning in a new costume. It has not shifted power, beam, width, or carrier to account for our position. We're catching spillage in the magnetotail. If we stood directly in the beam, the message would pass through us unchanged. "This is a lock rehearsing itself, rehearsing," she repeated, and seemed to like the word. "What property is it checking?" "Identity," I said, "but not the identity of a person. The identity of a class. It's looking for an authority shape we don't know how to wear." Could we fake it? There was nothing flippant in the question. I let my eyes rest on the little plant on the ledge until my answer could be controlled. We're not there. We don't have the bounding box of what there is. She nodded and left me to the box. In the quiet after, I changed how Thread listened. I shut down lexical prediction entirely, no more guessing which of our words fit their bones. I collapsed the mapping down to behavior only: allow, deny, elevate, defer. The sentence, stripped of our comforts, became a pulse train of permissions, oscillating in a pattern so precise it felt tyrannical. Every time the phrase enacted deny, there was a tiny latency increase, as though a ghosted path had to be walked even to close a door. I followed the delay backward, pulse by pulse, until it led me into a substructure I had not yet named. I watched the denial rise and fall and remembered the way a biometric scanner maps a face, not a photograph, but a topology. The machine was not seeing a petitioner and saying no. It was seeing a shape that did not match a stored mesh. It was saying not you because it had a you it wanted, not an individual, a builder. Thread, delighted to have a new hook to hang weight on, constellated a region of the map where other behaviors gathered around that shape. Authorize without query, repair on failure, escalate to design. The words were my labels, but the pulsed gravity in the model was not. I wrote to Arena. Hypothesis. Builder class as privileged identity in the permission lattice. Evidence. Denial latencies correlate with fallback path to builder-only routines. She answered with a question that trusted me. If it is looking for builders, what does it do when it finds none? I did not have the right to be comforted, and yet I was, a little, by the when rather than if. We engineer hope into pronouns and forgive ourselves later. I left the lab for the first time in days and walked the station's ring twice. Gravity was a half promise at that radius. It left you aware of your bones. In the observation bubble, a transparent blister on the station's skin, a junior tech slept with a tablet over their face. The gas giant filled the view like an emotion that refuses therapy. Past the bubble, the magneto-tail was a black river. We were a knife stuck in the seam of forces larger than our budgets. I returned to the lab with the smaller, sharper thought I had been avoiding. If it would not see us as builders, could we make it believe it had seen itself? Deception is not translation. It is theater, in which the stage directions are also the script. I built a second toy, an ugly, skeletal thing in the projection field that let me inject synthetic pulse trains into Thread's model as if they were incoming messages. I mimicked the beam's carrier characteristics as best the station's instruments would allow, and tried on various hats. A listener that only echoed, a listener that refused back, a listener that deferred to an invented authority with the right cadence, but the wrong weight. Each time, the model shrugged. The lattice did not soften. It softened only once, and not because of any brave trick. It softened when I stopped trying to be the listener at all, and instead modeled a message that declared itself to be the lattice. The moment was small and filthy and holy all at once. I felt sick, the way one does when a lie fits. I wrote the declaration in the simplest grammar the model would permit. I am the threshold. I am the lock. It was not content. It was adjudication. It did not request. It named. In my toy model, the declaration propagated through the lattice and quieted behaviors that had been rigid a moment before. A lower halo brightened around authorized without query. Thread gave me an amber dot again, the machine's equivalent of human side-eye. I saved the state and paced the lab until my muscles remembered sunlight. The vine on the ledge had leaned half a degree toward a lamp. I sent Arena only the map and the predecessors, not the sentence. Her reply was 2 words: "You're close." Security sent their own. If you can produce an authentication event, advise on signal injection pathway. Also, advise on risk. Major risks. It was almost kind of him not to define risk. I dug into how such a declaration would be judged, if judged at all. The lattice had 2 regions of logic I hadn't differentiated. The place where it evaluated identity and the place where it evaluated competence. The first was simple: builder or not builder. The second was a hill of tests concealed inside refusals. My earlier latencies were a fingertip graze across that surface. As the model improved, I began to see the tests hiding under the number. Prove you can hold synchronization at intolerant tolerances. Prove you can reject noise that is not noise. Prove you can reject your own desire. I stared at the last and put my hands in my pockets so I would not press anything. Desire is how humans ruin evidence. We crave yes so badly we invent it. I set up a dead channel, a band so quiet the station had named it for that quiet, and bled a fragment of my synthetic declaration into it at minimum power. The channel remained dead. Thread did not mark the injection. I exhaled in relief that felt like grief, and permitted myself a single vertical smile in the reflection of the window. Not yet. Not by accident. The fourth night since the start, the station hiccuped. A minor supply drone failed its approach vector and clipped a tether line on the far side maintenance truss. No damage, only a wave of blue curses on the operations channel and an admonition to check basic math. Still, my scripts ripple-aligned the hiccup across the beam capture and flagged it as I slept. When I woke, Thread had appended a note to the log in the brittle diction of a machine imitating my voice. External perturbation did not perturb. The beam did not care about our clumsiness. It was busy reciting itself, relief, disappointment, the complicated love one feels for an unresponsive God. By then, the spiral had completed another full revolution. The precessing flips had marched a quarter of the way around. The clock inside the lock kept its own liturgy. I estimated when it would complete a full cycle. Not long by some measures, too long by others. If the self-check closed a circle, what closed with it? A door? An eye? A memory? I called Arena and asked for the smallest thing that felt like sacrilege. I want the array to hum at the same interval the beam hums, I said. Not to transmit, only to breathe. The way a chorus takes a pitch from the organ before the first note, she did not ask why this in the tone that means convince me. She asked it in the tone that means help me see it with you. I told her, if the lattice encodes permission as a rhythm of performed authority, then our best first move is to align our diaphragm with its music. If it is deaf to us, nothing is lost. If it is listening for resonance, we will become part of its calculation without telling it a lie. Resonance is not harmless, she said, automatic, the reflex of a physicist who has watched bridges fall. That's why we breathe and do not sing, I said. I'm superstitious enough to think the difference matters. She got me a whisper channel on the array's housekeeping systems. Power draw only, no modulation on the dish. For 3 hours, with Van a Quiet Presence 2 consoles over, we made the station inhale on the 7,217 beat. Tiny cyclical changes in the load that were microscopic against the array's normal work. It felt like standing behind someone and matching step for step, so you do not startle them when you finally speak. On the second hour, the vine unfurled a tendril as if to declare ownership of a millimeter of air. The beam did not change. Of course it didn't. I told myself 3 times that non-response is data. The map in Thread did something that was not quite nothing. The latency under denial shaved a hair. I refused to call it significance. We burned the logs to storage anyway. That night, alone in the lab, I set the toy model beside the live capture and arranged them like a diptych. The art of what is and the art of what could be. My synthetic declaration looked obscene next to the real sentence, as if I had scrawled a signature on a temple. I tried a compromise that made me feel no cleaner. I wrote a wrapper of deference around the lie. At the threshold's request, the threshold speaks. The model dimmed its suspicion by a degree. My stomach did not. I dreamt of the cedar chest and woke with my right hand braced on the bench, 3 fingers pressing where wood once yielded, and knew that I had not left the house of language at all. I had simply found a new locked door inside it. In the morning, before Arena could arrive with her patients in a cup, I wrote a message to Major Ricks and did not send it. Risk summary. If we declare ourselves the threshold and the lattice believes us, we will have committed an act of impersonation that might grant us entry where entry implies obligation. If it does not believe us, we may teach it to flag our signature as hostile. If it half believes us, we may cause it to escalate to a builder routine we cannot survive. Recommendation: continue alignment without declaration until we can identify a signature that proves intent rather than merely power. I saved the draft and let it sit where my guilt could find it. Irina arrived with not coffee, but a silence I recognized. "Board wants a live verbal brief," she said. "They always ask for mouths when their hands are already moving." "What are their hands doing?" I asked. "Drafting legal language about jurisdiction if the structure becomes a resource," she said, and made a face so quick it was almost a glitch. "And scenarios if it is a weapon. There is talk of sending a drone to block the beam. It won't care," I said. "And if by some miracle it does, we will have taught it to notice us as breakers, not listeners." "I told them that," she said. "They asked for a probability. I said your probabilities would come with too many footnotes to fit on their slides." She set down her cup and leaned against the ledge where the vine pretended this was a world. "Kieran, when does listening become complicity?" "When the listener begins to answer," I said. It was not a moral position. It was anatomy. She held my gaze. "Then tell me when we will answer." "Soon," I said, "but not yet." We met the board through a hollowed-out secure channel that made everyone look as if their faces had been cut from thin paper and pressed to glass. They asked whether denial could be a threat. I said refusal is not the same as malice. They asked whether the beam could be a lure. I said bait does not rehearse permission in public. They asked whether we could shut it down. I said yes, by breaking our own ears. Irina spoke sparingly and well. Rix did not appear, which meant he was busy doing the things he would later deny. When they signed off, the room felt larger, as if their absence had returned oxygen to the ducts. Alone again, I turned to the spiral. The precession had advanced another small arc. The flips were coming toward a point I had not noticed until then, a seam where the stack's first and last messages would touch if the circle closed. I zoomed until the seam was a canyon line across my whole field of view. It was nothing, and it was the only thing that mattered. The machine had a place where its rehearsal completed itself. If a door exists, the hinge lives there. Thread let me hang a bell there, a tiny alert that would sound when the next flip reached the seam. Not an alarm, a chime the size of a thought. I hung it and pulled my chair close and rested my hand where cedar had once yielded. I told myself a rule so simple a child could live by it. Breathe with the thing you are trying to understand. The station inhaled. The beam recited. The chime did not sound. It would soon, and when it did, we would have no excuse to remain only listeners. The chime was smaller than a thought, and it went off like a bell in a cathedral. A single note from Thread, exactly when and where the spiral closed, where the first repetition would touch the last if time were a ring and not a string. I did not stand. I had been sitting with my hand on that imaginary cedar lid for so long that the bench knew the shape of my palm. Irina was already in the doorway with her cup and her patience. Van slid in behind her and took the far console, hands hovering. The station dimmed by a degree as if the lights, too, wanted to hear. "Seam," I said. My voice sounded like I'd carried it through customs. Irina set the cup down without looking away from the projection. On the wall, the spiral of repetitions had no drama to it, only inevitability. Every 7,217th flip, had marched around the curve in its slow procession, and now it had arrived at the hinge. The procession stilled, a tide resting between pulse and return. "Do we breathe?" she asked. "Or do we speak?" "We speak like breath," I said, "and only once." We had rehearsed without rehearsal, a whisper channel on the array's housekeeping systems, a dead band held open like a mouth that remembered song. Rix's authorization existed only as the absence of prevention. He appeared now, not in the doorway but on the wall, his face flattened by the secure channel the way paper flattens a flower. "You have 5 minutes before the board pulls my liens," he said. "Make whatever mistake you came to make." "Understood," Irina said, and muted him with a flick. There are times when kindness is a form of treason, and she chose our side. The declaration sat in thread like a sacrilege on an altar. 4 small clauses folded around a lie. At the threshold's request, the threshold speaks. I am the threshold. I am the lock. I returned to listening. The last line had cost me more than the others. It was not an apology. It was a promise that the lie would end in reverence. If a machine was going to believe me, it should know the shape of my regret. Van's hands never touched his console. He flew over it with 2 fingers and a wrist, aligning power draw and timing harmonics, sanding micro-ronus off the transmission slot until it would slide like glass. The plant on the ledge, all leaves and stubborn, had sent a tendril toward the lamp overnight. It trembled in the ducted air. "When the hinge opens," Irina said softly, "if it opens, what does it reveal?" "The thing that isn't a verb until permission exists," I said. "Action!" The countdown reached its quiet 0. I spread the map of the lattice to fill the room. The pulse train's permissions oscillated in hard, tyrannical exactness. At the seam, the pattern inhaled. It was not a pause, it was readiness. "On my mark," I said. Van's eyes cut to me and back. Irina's hand rested near the manual abort she wouldn't have time to use. Rix's face on the wall had become a museum mask. Not absence, not presence, just the weight of witness. "Mark," Van exhaled. The station shifted a weight too small to name. The declaration went out through the dead band with the ceremony of a whisper, passed in a crowded sanctuary, meant for one, heard by none. Nothing moved, no alarms, no haptics, no change in the beam's power envelope. The spiral did not falter. The station breathed. I felt, absurdly, the old childhood panic of telling a secret to a friend and realizing they had not heard you, that you would have to choose whether to repeat yourself and be foolish or keep the secret and swallow the ache. Then the map changed. Not the beam, the lattice. Thread's projection breathed in a way no machine should. The denial pulse stretched, as if the refusal had remembered a road it could take but usually didn't. Latencies shifted, a fly's footstep, a drip in a cave, and the permissions halo around authorized without query, brightened by a single, impossible lumen. "We're seen," I said. It was not a cry. It was a diagnosis. The beam's next repetition arrived on time. It did not say anything different. The one after that arrived early by 2 clock ticks, a violation so rude the part of me that loves grammar flinched. The sentence collapsed, not into silence, but into a form that Thread had no icon for. Permission without pronouncement. It was as if a door had opened, not onto a room but onto pressure, like a mountain that exists outside your idea of air. The station hummed sympathetically, then hard. Rix's voice came through, scrubbed of paper. "We're seeing field coupling on the long spines." "Is this it?" "This is it," Irina said, and her hands were steady. We were not inside the conversation. We were the surface it was choosing to use. The dead band, the mouth that remembered song, filled with a signal that wasn't ours and wasn't theirs and wasn't language. It was behavior. The lock performed a shape. The shape found purchase in our systems. The array's housekeeping power drew itself into a rhythm not under our control. Thread darkened its entire palette and labeled the incoming pattern with a word that made my skin recognize a heritage it had never had: liturgy. Translate, Rick said, and I almost laughed because the only honest word was no. It's not telling us, I said. It's measuring who we are when we answer. We're not answering, he said. We were. We had been since we decided to breathe with it. The lock had set a resonance, and we were choosing how to hold it. A test of competence hiding under denial. Prove you can hear without asking to speak. Prove you can align without trespass. Prove you can be trusted not to want the key. The dead band filled with the shape again, and Thread found a correspondence in the lattice no one would have expected. The permission halo around repair on failure pulsed. A builder routine, not thrown, offered. I think it's giving us the instructions it gives itself when something breaks, I said, and the hair on my arm stood up as if my body understood the blasphemy before my mind did. It thinks the denial failed. It is inviting the lattice to heal. Can we? Irina began and stopped because the verb would make us thieves. If we followed the routine, we would not be opening, we would be mending. The difference was moral, only if your morals hadn't been starved long enough to eat anything. Do it, said Rix. What if repair implies ownership? Irina asked. What if we fall through a hole and the hole keeps falling? I asked back, and then hated that I had spoken in poetry when we needed math. The shape came again. Thread struggled, and then, like a hand finding the old pressure point on warped wood, the model yielded. A narrow path opened inside the lattice marked by permissions we had no right to read. A subroutine that assumed the presence of a builder's tools, a builder's token, a builder's memory of what the lock had been built to keep out and what it had been built to keep in. I did not have those, but I had a lie wrapped in reverence, and I had the one qualification the lattice seemed to value more than any artifact. I was willing to end by listening. I can mirror the repair behavior without asserting the identity that usually runs it, I said. Echo only. No injection of content, no request. A human voice that shapes itself to the logic. Nothing more. Irina looked up sharply. Kieran. I know what impersonation is, I said. This isn't that. I won't say I am the lock again. I'll say I can hear the lock's work and hold it steady while it heals itself. I'll be the hand on the lid, nothing more. Rick said, if something reaches back along your hand, I cut the arm. Fair, I said, and a laugh escaped me, bright and wrong. We prepared the simplest thing I have ever built and the most complicated thing I will ever do. No data, no commands. Only a pattern of attention threaded through the dead band, a human nervous system arranged into a metronome that matched the shape of the lattice's repair song. Thread mapped every twitch of my fingers, every small betrayal of ease. Irina smoothed those betrayals into a waveform that would not snag on sharp edges. Van kept our timing in the pocket of 2 ticks where an error would either mean nothing or end this with a scream. Last call, Irina said. Do we dare turn this into a method? This is not a method, I said. It's a vow. The lock sang its brokenness. We answered by holding the pitch. It was like standing on a frozen lake. and hearing the ice choose how not to break. It was like holding your breath beside a sleeping child and deciding that the only thing you are allowed to want is the next breath they take. It was like Lyra's last fever hour, when the only language left in the room was counting. Minutes, seconds, ticks on a clock we had not built. The lattice tightened itself around a wound we could not see. The permission halo around authorize without query did not brighten. It steadied. The one around escalate to design dimmed, the way a parent's hand loosens when a child stops drowning in air. Thread marked the change with its small, implacable diction. State, integrity partial, gate, present, denial, active, listener, recorded. Recorded, Rix repeated. It knows we helped, Irina said. Not helped, I said, and realized I was shaking. Witnessed. The beam returned to its previous cadence. The spiral resumed its procession, the flips marching again like a procession after a hymn. The dead band went dead. The array's hum softened. The plant's tendril trembled and was still. Silence filled the lab in the way thunder does when it is very far away, and you count to find out how safe you were and are not. On Thread's log, new lines wrote themselves in the tidy script I'd given the machine to make it feel less like a stranger in the dark. Echo acknowledged. Echo not builder. Echo permitted proximate holding. Echo protocol. Available when seam recurs. Cost unknown. Irina's hand found the back of the chair and stayed there, not on me, not on the machine. Sublimate comfort rendered polite. You named it, she said. It named itself, I said. It was a half-truth. All names are. Rix cleared his throat, which in a room like this is a confession. What did we buy? What did we owe? A place at the hinge, I said, and heard Lyra's voice in mine, the way she could say a thing that would sound like both mercy and sentence. When the seam returns, it will expect the echo to be present. If we hold the pitch, it will continue to heal itself in our hearing. If we stay away, it will repair alone and close us out. If we try to speak content into that space, we will be... I searched for a word that wasn't punished, because that would make this a god, and gods are too easy. Excluded? By when? He asked. I pointed to the spiral. When the flips have marched the circle again, a calendar you can print. He nodded once, the way soldiers accept calendars and deaths. We filed our report to the board with the quiet crime of having done more than they had asked. They would read it in pieces and try to parcel it to committees and budgets. They would ask what a hinge is worth per quarter. They would ask whether an echo can be made to scale. I felt a tenderness for their questions as one feels for a child who thinks a window is the same size as what you can see through it. We spent the next 2 days doing the work that makes the story survivable, writing code that thinks less of itself, teaching the array to hum without tearing its own throat, teaching Thread to mark my tremors without telling me what they mean. Irina added a lamp with a warmer spectrum. The vine took it as a personal affront and grew toward it like a threat. Van slept once in a chair for 7 minutes and woke with a start, naming frequencies as if they were lovers he had cheated on. News traveled the way it always does, wrong first, then in fragments, then wrong again. A rumor reached us that the structure around Chiron 4 had shifted its orbit by a measurable whisper. Another said a shuttle crew had knelt in the observation bubble and wept when the beam arrived early and then righted itself. Someone wrote a ballad in the canteen and was told to wait until the next seemed to sing it. On the morning of the second recurrence, Rix stood in the doorway like a question he was willing to ask aloud. "If it requires you," he said, "what happens when you sleep, or fail, or die?" "Then it repairs alone," I said, "or appoints another echo. It does not need us. It has never needed us. That's why we can meet it clean." He nodded, and something in his face cracked like thin ice and did not break. "You're sure you want to be the one who listens for the rest of us?" "No," I said, "but I know how." He gave me a new glove, unnecessary in a lab with breathable air. It was heavy where it shouldn't be, and fit better than it had a right to. "If something reaches back along your hand," he repeated, "I cut the arm." "I know," I said. "Thank you." When the chime sounded again, I stood instead of sitting. Irina took her place by the abort she would not reach. Van aligned the world by 2 ticks. The spiral breathed. The lock rehearsed permission. The dead band opened like a throat. The repair liturgy arrived, and I arranged myself into a metronome and held my pulse like a borrowed ring. We were not let in. We were let near. It was enough to change everything. Thread, efficient and incurious as always, wrote on its log while I shook and pretended not to. Echo protocol. Stable. Builder routines. Gated. Message. Still. This key is not for you. The last line should have felt like mockery. It felt like a vow kept. The key is not for us. The lock is not against us. The door remains a door because we did not kick it down to call it a prize. After, Irina sat on the edge of my bench and didn't scold me for the way my hands would not stop moving. The plant stood stupidly victorious in its square of light. Rix's paper face had vanished from the wall. He was doing the kind of work that erases the man who does it. The station breathed. The magneto-tail whispered. I opened Thread's private log and wrote down a thing I had not allowed into text since Vesta. Lyra's name. It glowed in the dim for a moment and then became plain. I said it aloud as the dead band closed, and for one long second, the room made room for it as if the lattice itself had ears for the part of language where love hides. On the far screen, the structure around Chiron 4 remained a quiet knife at a black seam. The beam kept reciting its refusal, the way monks keep vows after the abbey is gone. Between the repetitions, a calendar formed that no human committee had authorized. The station got used to counting in a rhythm not of its own invention. The board got used to approving budgets with line items called seam support and echo stabilization. That is what victory looks like when the enemy was not an enemy and the prize is learning how to hold still inside longing. We did not get a word back, not a name, not a greeting. What we got was a place to stand while the lock healed in our hearing. Sometimes, the most generous thing in a universe of weapons is a door that remembers it can refuse. On the third recurrence, the lattice did something I could not have asked for because I would have ruined it by asking. It marked the echo with a small, colorless token in its logic. A placeholder where a builder's credential would be, not lit, not activated, only acknowledged. Listener, present, wrote Thread. Listener, proximate. Listener, permitted to return. The word permitted cracked something in me I had built to survive. I did not weep. I put my hand on the bench in the old pressure and felt the station's hum arrive exactly where my palm expected it, and I let that be what counted as joy. This key is not for you. It isn't. And yet, in the seam between refusals, a life opens wide enough to walk into. We will be here when it returns. We will hold the pitch. We will keep our hands steady on the lid. When it is ready to be a door, If it ever is, it will not find us kicking at its hinges. It will find us listening. Some nights, when the station assigns darkness and the coil lights downshift to a kinder color and the plant claims another millimeter of air like a nation, I sit alone with Thread and the dead band and I say Lyra's name into the middle of nothing. I do not expect an answer. The work has taught me the beauty of refusal and the holiness of silence. The universe does not owe us speech. It owes us presence, and even that is more generosity than law. The seam will sound again. We will go to the hinge. We will breathe with a machine that learned to rehearse permission in public. And somewhere, in a grammar, we have only begun to map. A new clause may be pressed into the space between denial and design. A clause that says, "You may be here while I am myself." We will take it. We will call it enough. And when the book closes, it will do so on a door not opened, but no longer indifferent to the hand that waits.